I'm Logan, 28, a software engineer with a story about family betrayal that still stings. When my dad and stepsister Megan decided I needed to give up my childhood bedroom and move to the basement, they had no idea I knew about their financial troubles. They never expected I would buy our family home at auction right under their noses. The looks on their faces when those ownership papers arrived, priceless. Before I tell you how this all went down, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up for yourself when family takes you for granted. My early life was picture perfect, or at least that's how I remember it. Mom and Dad were happily married, and our home was filled with laughter and warmth. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was home. Every weekend we would go to the park or have barbecues in the backyard. Those memories are still crystal clear to me. Everything changed when Mom died of cancer when I was 10. It was sudden and devastating. She went from being diagnosed to gone in just 8 months. Dad was broken. I was lost. For 2 years, it was just us trying to figure out how to exist without her. Dad worked long hours to keep himself busy, and I spent a lot of time alone retreating into video games and books. The house that once felt warm now felt empty and cold. When I was 12, Dad met Stephanie at a work function. She was nice enough, I suppose. She had a daughter named Megan who was 14 at the time. Within 6 months they were married, and suddenly our quiet house was filled with new voices and new routines. I tried to be open to the change. I really did. Stephanie was always cordial to me, but there was an emotional distance that never quite closed. She would make my lunches and ask about school, but there was always something performative about it. Like she was playing the role of stepmom rather than actually wanting to be one. I never felt comfortable confiding in her the way I had with my mom. Megan, on the other hand, made no pretense of wanting a brother. From day one, she treated me like an inconvenience. She was loud, demanding, and seemed to think that everything in the house was now hers by default. Dad never corrected this behavior. Instead, he seemed almost desperate to make Megan feel welcome often, at my expense. Logan, let Megan choose the movie tonight. Logan, Megan needs to use the computer for homework. Logan, don't argue with your sister. She wasn't my sister. Not really. And every time Dad called her that, I felt my real mom's memory fade a little more. My bedroom became my sanctuary. It wasn't large, but it was mine. Posters of my favorite bands covered the walls. My gaming setup sat in the corner on a desk I had built with Dad before Mom died. My bookshelf was packed with science fiction novels and computer programming books. The blue paint on the walls was chosen by Mom and me when I was 8. Every inch of that room held memories and meaning. Through high school, I focused on my studies. While Megan was going to parties and racking up phone bills with her endless social life, I was taking advanced placement classes and building websites for local businesses. Dad seemed proud but distracted. His attention was increasingly directed toward Megan and her drama. She was good at creating situations that required everyone to drop everything and focus on her. I got accepted to the state university to study computer science. It wasn't Ivy League, but it was a solid program with good job placement rates. Dad seemed proud but commented that it was a practical choice, which somehow felt like a backhanded compliment. Megan, meanwhile, got into a private arts college across the country, and Dad threw her a massive graduation party. The contrast wasn't lost on me. To save money during college, I continued living at home and commuted to campus. I also worked part-time at the campus IT department to help pay for books and tuition. Dad had set aside some money for my education, but with Megan, at an expensive private school, resources were stretched thin. I rarely asked for money, knowing the answer would likely be a strained explanation about tight budgets. Despite living in the same house, I saw less and less of Dad. He worked late, and when he was home, he was usually on the phone with Stephanie discussing Megan's latest crisis at school. I became increasingly invisible in my own home, eating dinners alone and passing like a ghost through the hallways. I graduated with honors and landed a good job at a software company in the city. The salary was excellent for a recent graduate, and I started saving aggressively for my own place. But housing prices in our area were steep, and I calculated that staying home for another year would allow me to save enough for a substantial down payment. Dad didn't object when I proposed this plan. In fact, he seemed relieved and immediately suggested I start paying rent. I agreed, thinking it was fair. Just as I was hitting my stride professionally, Megan dropped out of college after 3.5 years without completing her degree. She claimed the professors didn't understand her creative vision and that she needed time to find herself. Suddenly, she was back home occupying all the space and attention once again. But this time she brought a cloud of failure and resentment with her. The tension in the house became unbearable. Megan would sleep until noon, leave messes everywhere, and snap at anyone who suggested she look for a job. Dad and Stephanie tiptoed around her moods while I watched in disbelief. I kept my head down, worked hard, and counted the days until I could afford my own place. Little did I know things were about to get much worse. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed. I had just finished a grueling day at work, debugging a critical system that had crashed overnight. My back ached from hunching over my keyboard for 10 straight hours, and all I wanted was a hot shower and some peace and quiet. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed that everyone's cars were home already, which was unusual for a weeknight. The smell of pot roast greeted me as I walked through the door. Stephanie was pulling a dish from the oven, and Dad was setting the table for 4. Megan was slumped on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Something felt off. Dad wasn't usually home early enough to help with dinner, and Stephanie rarely made pot roast, which happened to be my favorite meal growing up. "Perfect timing," Dad said with a forced smile. "Dinner's just ready." We gathered around the table in awkward silence hanging in the air as Stephanie served the food. Small talk felt strained as Dad asked about my day in a way that seemed mechanical, like he was reading from a script. Megan barely looked up from her plate, pushing the food around more than eating it. So Dad finally said, after clearing his throat, "There's something we need to discuss as a family." The tone in his voice made my stomach tighten. I'd heard that forced casualness before, usually right before bad news. "Megan is going through a difficult transition period right now," he continued, glancing at my stepsister, who suddenly seemed very interested in her dinner role. "She needs some stability and space to figure out her next steps." I nodded slowly, not sure where this was going, but already feeling defensive. "The thing is," Logan, Dad said, making brief eye contact, before looking away, "Megan needs your room. We think having her own proper space will help her get back on her feet." The words hit me like a physical blow. I put down my fork and stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You want me to give up my bedroom, the one I've had for 18 years. My voice came out calmer than I felt. Stephanie jumped in. "It would just be temporary until Megan gets situated. You understand, right?" I looked from face to face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of bad joke. "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" "We've been thinking about fixing up the basement," Dad replied quickly, as if he'd rehearsed this part. "We could put up some drywall, bring down your bed. It would be like your own apartment." "The basement," I repeated incredulously. "The unfinished basement with concrete floors and no bathroom, the one that floods every spring." "We'll get a dehumidifier," Stephanie offered, as if that solved everything. Megan finally spoke up. "I just can't focus in the guest room. It's too small and all my stuff is in boxes. I need a real room." I felt my face grow hot. "And my room of nearly 2 decades isn't real to you. The room Mom and I painted together, that's just up for grabs now." Dad's expression hardened. "Don't bring your mother into this. This is about what the family needs right now." "The family," I laughed without humor. "Or just what Megan needs again." "That's enough," Logan, Dad said sharply. "Megan is going through a tough time. She needs our support, not your attitude." I pushed back from the table and stood up. "When I was going through a tough time after Mom died, I didn't get to kick anyone out of their bedroom. I dealt with it, like an adult." Stephanie placed a hand on Dad's arm as he started to rise. "We're not asking you to leave, Logan. We're just asking you to be flexible. Family helps family." As I looked around the table, I noticed a stack of mail on the counter behind them. Bills with red past due stamps visible even from where I stood. A disconnect notice from the power company partially hidden under a magazine. The first pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I needed to solve. "When do you need me out by?" I asked flatly. "We thought this weekend would work," Dad replied, relief evident in his voice at my apparent surrender. "I can help you move your things down." 1 week, I countered. "I need time to pack properly and figure out what goes where, and time to investigate what was really going on in this house." "Fine. 1 week." Dad nodded, already turning his attention back to his meal as if the matter was settled. I left my dinner half-eaten and retreated to my room for just 7 more days. As I closed the door, I leaned against it and tried to process what had just happened. The room that had been my safe haven through my mother's death, through the arrival of Stephanie and Megan, through high school and college stress, was being taken away. And for what so Megan could have more space to find herself while contributing nothing. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the familiar cracks in my ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Outside my door, I heard hushed, urgent whispers between Dad and Stephanie. Something about buying time and just until the refinance comes through. Their voices were strained with a tension that went beyond Megan's room situation. Over the next few days, I began packing my life into boxes. Each poster carefully rolled, each book stacked and labeled. 18 years of memories being prepared for exile to the basement. As I worked, the anger gave way to a hollow feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just about the room anymore. It was about my place in this family, or lack thereof. Megan occasionally poked her head in to see how the evacuation was progressing, not offering help but making comments about where she planned to put her things. Each visit stoked the embers of my resentment. "I'm thinking of painting the walls lavender," she mentioned casually on day 3 of my packing. "Daddy already said it was fine." Daddy. She still called him that at 22, especially when she wanted something. And it still worked like a charm. By the end of the week, my room was stripped of personality, the walls bare, except for the faded blue paint chosen so many years ago. The last thing I took down was a photo of Mom and me at the beach, her smile radiant despite the cancer that was already quietly growing inside her. As I carefully wrapped the frame in a t-shirt, I made a silent promise to her that I wouldn't let myself be pushed around anymore. I just didn't know yet how dramatically I would keep that promise. The basement was exactly as I had feared, cold, damp, and thoroughly uninviting. Dad had hastily cleared a space in the corner, set up my bed frame, and thrown down an old area rug that did little to soften the concrete floor. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across my new bedroom. There was no privacy, no proper closet, not even a door. Just an open staircase leading up to the kitchen. "We'll get some room dividers," Dad promised, as he helped bring down the last of my boxes. His eyes avoided the water stains on the concrete walls, evidence of the spring flooding I had mentioned. "And maybe a space heater for now." I nodded silently, already calculating how quickly I could find an apartment. The basement smelled of mildew and forgotten holiday decorations. A stark contrast to the room upstairs that was now being transformed into Megan's new sanctuary. That first night in the basement was miserable. The sounds of the house were different from down there. Every footstep above was amplified, and the furnace kicked on with a roar every hour. I lay on my bed staring at the exposed pipes and electrical conduits running along the ceiling and listened. Around midnight, I heard Dad and Stephanie in the kitchen directly above me. Their voices were low but tense. The words mostly indistinct, except for occasional phrases that drifted down the open stairwell. Third notice already. Can't keep putting them off. What if they freeze the accounts? The next morning I woke up chilled to the bone despite the space heater Dad had brought down. As I made my way upstairs to shower, the house was quiet. A note on the kitchen counter informed me that Dad had gone to work early, Stephanie was at a doctor's appointment, and Megan was still asleep and not to be disturbed. I noticed the stack of mail had been moved, tucked hastily into a drawer that hadn't fully closed. Something about the urgency of last night's conversation and the hidden mail triggered my suspicion. I glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, listened for any movement, then quietly pulled open the drawer. What I found confirmed my growing suspicions. Bills, lots of them, many stamped with final notices and threats of collection. The mortgage statement showed 3 months of missed payments. Credit card statements revealed maxed out limits and minimum payments missed. A letter from a debt consolidation service lay opened its contents, outlining dire financial straits. I carefully returned everything exactly as I had found it, my mind racing. If the house was in financial trouble, why hadn't Dad said anything? I had been paying rent for months. Where was that money going, if not toward the mortgage? Later that day, I needed a screwdriver to secure a wobbly shelf I was setting up in the basement. Dad's tools were kept in his home office desk, so I headed there to borrow one. As I rummaged through the desk drawer, I found more evidence of financial distress. A notice of intent to foreclose on our house dated just 2 weeks earlier. My heart pounded as I read the document. The bank was giving them 30 days to bring the mortgage current before initiating foreclosure proceedings. The amount needed was substantial, far more than I had been paying in rent, but not entirely out of reach with my savings. Over the next few days, I began a careful investigation. When everyone was out, I photographed key documents with my phone. At work, I researched property records and foreclosure processes. What I discovered was alarming. Our house was scheduled for a foreclosure auction in just 3 weeks. The family home where I had grown up, where my last memories of Mom were housed, was about to be sold to the highest bidder. I also discovered that Dad had taken out a second mortgage 2 years ago, right around the time Megan started her expensive private college. The pieces were falling into place. My father had leveraged the house to fund Megan's education, and now that she had dropped out, the financial house of cards was collapsing. The revelation left me with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was angry that Dad had hidden this from me while asking for rent. On the other hand, I understood the shame and fear that might have prevented him from admitting the truth. But what bothered me most was that even now, with financial ruin looming, his priority had been to ensure Megan's comfort by giving her my room. One evening, about a week after my basement relocation, I decided to confront Dad directly. I found him alone in the kitchen, reviewing what appeared to be more bills with a calculator in hand. "Dad, we need to talk about the house," I said, sitting across from him. He looked up, startled, and quickly gathered the papers. "What about the house?" "I know about the foreclosure notice. I know we're about to lose it." His face went pale, then flushed with anger. "You've been going through my things." "That's private, Logan." "I found it by accident," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. "But that's not the point. Why didn't you tell me I've been paying rent while you're 3 months behind on the mortgage? Where has that money been going?" Dad's shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked older than his 56 years. "It's complicated. There are a lot of expenses you don't know about. Like Megan's college tuition. The tuition for the degree she didn't finish." "Don't start with that," he warned. "Your sister." "Stepsister," I corrected automatically. "Megan," he continued with emphasis, "made a choice that didn't work out. We're adjusting. And frankly, this is none of your business. You're an adult with a job. You pay rent to live here like any adult would. It becomes my business when I'm about to lose the roof over my head without any warning," I countered. "Were you planning to tell me before the sheriff showed up to evict us? Or was that going to be a surprise too?" Dad stood up abruptly. "I'm handling it. I have options." "What options?" "The house is going to auction in 3 weeks." His eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" I looked it up. "Public records, Dad. Anyone can see them." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I'm working with the bank. There's still time to stop it." But I could see in his eyes that he was out of solutions. Whatever plans he had tried had failed. And now, he was just playing for time. "I want to help," I offered. "I have some savings. Maybe we can." "No," he cut me off firmly. "I don't need your money. I need you to mind your own business and let me handle this. I'm still the father here." With that, he gathered his papers and left the kitchen, ending the conversation. I sat there for a long time, weighing my options. Dad was too proud to accept my help directly and too deep in denial to admit the severity of the situation to the rest of the family. That night, I began apartment hunting in earnest. If the house was going to be lost, I needed a backup plan. I looked at several places, all small and overpriced, but available immediately. Yet as I toured each sterile, unfamiliar apartment, a different idea began to take shape in my mind. On a whim, I searched online for the foreclosure auction details. There it was, our address listed among dozens of others, with starting bids and auction rules clearly outlined. The minimum bid for our house was well below market value, reflecting the bank's desire for a quick sale to recover their losses. I stared at the screen, an impossible thought forming. What if I didn't need an apartment? What if there was another option? One that could either save my family or teach them the ultimate lesson about taking me for granted. It was crazy. It was potentially financially ruinous. It was exactly what I needed to do. The idea of buying my childhood home at a foreclosure auction seemed absurd at first. I spent a sleepless night in the damp basement calculating and recalculating my finances. I had been saving aggressively since starting my job, living frugally despite decent pay. The down payment I had been accumulating for my own future home was substantial, but was it enough? The next morning I called my friend Anthony, who worked as a loan officer at a local bank. We met for coffee during my lunch break, and I explained the situation without revealing that the property in question was my family home. Foreclosure auctions are risky, Logan Anthony warned, stirring his coffee. You typically need cash or proof of funds ready to go. There's often no financing contingency, like with a normal home purchase. What about pre-approval? Would that be enough? Anthony considered this. Sometimes. It depends on the auction rules. But even then, you'd need a sizable down payment, and you'd have to move fast after winning to secure the actual loan. And what about the inspection process? The house I'm looking at, I'm not sure of its condition. This was a lie, of course. I knew every creaky floorboard and leaky faucet in that house. That's the other risk. Most foreclosures are as is, no inspection. You get what you get. Anthony leaned forward. Is this really what you want to get into? First-time homebuyers usually go the conventional route for a reason. I nodded, already running numbers in my head. I'm just exploring options. The property seems undervalued. After parting ways with Anthony, I returned to work but couldn't focus. I pulled up my bank accounts and investment portfolio on my computer. Between my savings account, a small investment account, and a certificate of deposit that was nearing maturity, I had about 20% of the likely auction price. Not ideal, but potentially workable with the right loan. That evening, I stayed late at the office, using the quiet to research everything about foreclosure auctions. I learned about the pre-registration requirements, the need for certified funds for deposits, and the quick closing timelines. It was daunting, but not impossible. The next day, I visited 3 different banks, securing a pre-approval letter from each based on my credit score and income. I was surprised at how straightforward the process was. My years of financial responsibility were finally paying off. The pre-approvals weren't guarantees, but they were a start. The most challenging part came next. To prevent my family from discovering my plan, I needed to create some distance between myself and the purchase. After consulting with a real estate attorney who specialized in foreclosures, I decided to form a limited liability company, LLC. For a few $100s and some paperwork, Horizon Property Holdings, LLC, was born with me as the sole member. The attorney assured me this was common practice for investors and would provide a layer of anonymity. With the LLC established, I registered for the auction under the company name rather than my own. I arranged for a cashier's check for the required deposit made out to the auction company from the LLC account. Each step felt surreal, like I was playing a character in a movie rather than making life-altering decisions. As the auction date approached, I grew increasingly anxious but also resolute. Living in the basement had only reinforced my determination. The conditions were worse than I had anticipated. A heavy rainfall had resulted in water seeping through the foundation, soaking the area rug, and forcing me to elevate my belongings on milk crates. Dad had apologized half-heartedly, but taken no real action to address the problem. Meanwhile, Megan had fully settled into my former room. I overheard her on the phone with friends laughing about how she had upgraded to a bigger space. She had painted one wall lavender as promised, and had hung string lights across the ceiling, modifications I had never been allowed to make. The injustice of it burned, fueling my resolve. The financial strain on the household was becoming more evident by the day. Grocery shopping became more strategic, with Stephanie opting for store brands and sale items. The thermostat was set lower than usual, leading to chilly mornings where everyone wore sweaters indoors. Dad started coming home later, presumably working overtime to generate extra income. Yet through it all, no one acknowledged the looming foreclosure, to me treating it like a shameful secret. One night, about a week before the auction, I nearly confessed my plan to Dad. He looked so worn down, sitting alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, reviewing the same bills again and again, as if the numbers might magically change. For a moment, I felt guilty about my secret machinations. Wouldn't it be simpler to just offer financial help directly? But then Megan had stomped downstairs, complaining loudly that the Wi-Fi was too slow for her to stream movies in her room, and demanded Dad upgrade the internet package. Instead of explaining that we could barely keep the lights on, Dad had simply promised to look into it. My sympathy evaporated. This pattern would never change, unless something forced it to. The day before the auction, I prepared meticulously. I withdrew the necessary funds for the deposit and kept the cashier's check in a secure inner pocket of my jacket. I reviewed the auction rules one final time and planned my route to ensure I would arrive early. To avoid suspicion, I told my family I had an important client meeting the next day and would be unreachable for several hours. That night, I could barely sleep. The basement felt especially cold and unwelcoming, as if reminding me of what I was fighting against. I scrolled through photos on my phone, pictures of the house from happier times, family gatherings in the backyard, Mom gardening in the front yard. This wasn't just about reclaiming my room or teaching my family a lesson. It was about preserving something precious that was about to be lost through mismanagement and favoritism. As dawn broke on auction day, I felt strangely calm. The anxiety had given way to a clear-headed determination. Whatever happened today would change everything. I just wasn't sure yet if it would be for better or worse. But one thing was certain. After today, I would no longer be the invisible, taken-for-granted son relegated to the flooding basement. One way or another, I was taking back control. I called in sick to work for the first time since starting my job. My supervisor was understanding, having witnessed my usual dedication, and wished me a speedy recovery. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wasn't physically ill, but this whole situation had been making me sick for weeks. The foreclosure auction was being held at the county courthouse, an imposing stone building downtown that I had passed countless times but never entered. I arrived 90 minutes early, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks to project an air of professional competence. The security guard at the metal detector nodded as I passed through, just another businessman on a typical Wednesday. Following signs to courtroom 3B, I found a small gathering of people, already waiting outside the closed doors. Most were middle-aged men in suits with Bluetooth earpieces, clearly experienced property investors or representatives for larger companies. A few were couples speaking in hushed tones and reviewing papers, nervously, likely first-timers like me. I took a seat on a bench against the wall, trying to appear casual, while my heart hammered in my chest. At precisely 9 o'clock, a court official opened the doors and the small crowd filed in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with rows of wooden benches facing a raised platform where a woman in a blazer was setting up a laptop and projector. No judge would be presiding. This was an administrative proceeding, not a trial. We were each given a packet with the properties listed in order of auction, complete with addresses, opening bids, and basic property details. I flipped through quickly, finding our house listed as property number 17. The starting bid was indeed below market value, though not dramatically so. I calculated that with the expected competitive bidding, the final price would likely approach something closer to fair market value. The auctioneer, a fast-talking woman with graying hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, explained the rules. Each property would be shown on the projector screen with relevant details. Bidding would start at the minimum amount listed and proceed in increments of $1,000. A winning bid required a 10% deposit immediately, with the balance due within 30 days. Failure to complete the purchase would result in forfeiture of the deposit and potential legal consequences. All properties are sold as is. Where is, she emphasized. There are no warranties or guarantees expressed or implied. It is the bidder's responsibility to have done their due diligence prior to bidding. I nodded along with the other attendees, though unlike them, I knew exactly what issues came with property number 17. The leaky roof over the kitchen that Dad had patched, rather than properly repaired. The aging water heater that produced lukewarm showers at best. The basement that flooded with every heavy rain, a fact I had experienced firsthand. The auction began with a small commercial property that attracted spirited bidding between two men who seemed to know each other, exchanging tight smiles as they drove the price higher. Next came several condominiums that sold quickly, followed by a few properties that received no bids at all and were returned to the bank's inventory. As each property was auctioned, I felt the tension building in my shoulders. Property number 10. Then 14. My palms began to sweat. I rehearsed my bidding strategy mentally. Start strong but not overeager. Maintain a poker face. Don't get emotional. Next up, property number 17, the auctioneer announced. Our address appeared on the screen along with a Google Street View image of the house. My stomach lurched, seeing our home displayed so publicly reduced to just another distressed property. 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, single-family residence. Approximately 1,800 square feet. Starting bid is $175,000. Do I have $175? A man in the front row raised his paddle immediately. $175. I have $175. Do I have $180? The auctioneer called. I raised my paddle, my arm feeling oddly heavy. $180. $180 from number 23. Do I have $185? The first bidder raised his paddle again without hesitation. Then a woman toward the back joined in. $190. The bidding continued steadily. $195. $200. $205. Each increment, pushing the price closer to what I had calculated as my absolute maximum. The initial bidder dropped out at $215, leaving just me and the woman in the back. $220 I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman hesitated for the first time, consulting what appeared to be a spreadsheet on her tablet. Finally, she raised her paddle. $225. My heart sank. I had authorized myself to go to $230 as an absolute ceiling, but I was already feeling lightheaded at the thought of taking on such a massive debt. Still, the alternative, letting a stranger take our family home, was unthinkable. $230, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The auctioneer looked to the woman in the back. $230 is the bid. Do I have $235? A long pause followed. The woman appeared to be making calculations, perhaps calling someone for authorization. The courtroom felt unnaturally quiet as everyone waited. Finally, she shook her head. $230. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. She scanned the room for any last-minute bidders. Sold for $230,000 to bidder number 23. A small smattering of applause broke the tension, apparently a tradition for the final bid of the day. I remained frozen in my seat, the reality slowly sinking in. I had just bought my childhood home out from under my own family. I was now technically their landlord. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork. I presented my cashier's check for the deposit and my pre-approval letter for the remainder. I signed documents acknowledging the terms of the sale and the timeline for closing. The court official explained that I would receive the official deed once the balance was paid and all paperwork processed, which would take approximately 2 to 3 weeks. As I left the courthouse, the bright midday sun felt surreal after the fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. I stood on the steps, legal documents clutched in my hand, experiencing a strange mix of triumph and terror. I had done something bold, something that would forever change my relationship with my family. There was no going back now. I drove home in a daze, parking a block away to collect my thoughts before facing everyone. Dad would still be at work, but Stephanie might be home, and Megan almost certainly would be. How would I act normally? Knowing what I now knew, should I tell them immediately or wait for the official paperwork? After careful consideration, I decided to wait. The purchase wasn't fully complete until closing, and there were still loans to finalize and paperwork to process. Better to have everything in order before dropping this bomb on the family. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work, came home to my basement apartment, and acted as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I was in constant contact with my loan officer insurance agents and the attorney handling the closing. Each night I lay awake planning how I would reveal the truth and imagining the possible reactions. Dad continued to look increasingly stressed, taking private phone calls and checking the mail before anyone else could see it. Stephanie had started picking up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Megan remained oblivious, still complaining about trivial inconveniences while the financial catastrophe loomed. Finally, 23 days after the auction, I received an email from my attorney. The transaction was complete. The deed had been recorded with the county. Horizon Property Holdings, LLC. My company was now the legal owner of the house. The attorney had also prepared a formal letter to the current occupants, my family, informing them of the change in ownership and requesting they contact the new owner, me, regarding their continued occupancy. That evening I stopped at a print shop and had the documents professionally printed and placed in a formal envelope. As I drove home, I rehearsed what I would say one final time. This was it, the moment of truth that would either heal my family or break it apart completely. The envelope sat heavy in my jacket pocket as I walked through the front door that evening. The house was unusually quiet for a Thursday night. Typically, Megan would have the television blaring in the living room or music playing from her speakers upstairs, my speakers technically that she had borrowed when taking over my room. I found everyone in the kitchen. Dad sat at the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing what appeared to be a legal document. Stephanie stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, her face drawn with worry. Megan sat across from them, for once not on her phone, her expression uncharacteristically somber. They looked up as I entered, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to uncomfortable. I had clearly interrupted something important. Logan, Dad said, removing his glasses. Good timing. We were just about to call a family meeting. What's going on? I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. Dad gestured for me to sit down. I took the chair opposite him next to Megan, who barely acknowledged my presence. There's no easy way to say this, Dad began, his voice strained. We're having some financial difficulties that affect all of us. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. The house. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. We've fallen behind on the mortgage payments. Significantly behind. How significantly? I asked, playing along. The bank has foreclosed on the property, Stephanie interjected gently. The house was sold at auction a few weeks ago. What does that mean for us? I directed the question to Dad, watching his face carefully. It means we have to leave, he replied, his voice hollow. The new owner has given us 30 days to vacate the premises. Megan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly slammed her hand on the table. This is bullshit. They can't just kick us out. We've lived here for years. Actually, they can. Dad corrected her tiredly. That's how foreclosure works. We don't own the house anymore. So who does? I asked, the envelope feeling impossibly heavy in my pocket now. Dad shook his head. Some investment company. Horizon something. Probably going to flip it or rent it out at twice what the mortgage was. I just don't understand how this happened, Stephanie said, her voice trembling slightly. We were managing. No, we weren't, Dad admitted. We haven't been managing for a long time. The second mortgage to pay for Megan's college, the credit card debt, my reduced hours at work last year. It all caught up with us. I thought I could turn it around, but... He trailed off, staring at his hands. Megan's face crumpled. So this is my fault. Because I went to college. No, honey, no, Stephanie rushed to reassure her. It's no one's fault. These things happen to many families. I sat silently watching the family drama unfold. Part of me wanted to reveal the truth immediately, to end their suffering. Another part, the part still angry about being displaced to the basement, about years of being an afterthought, wanted to let them stew a little longer. Have you looked into apartments? I asked Dad. He nodded grimly. Rentals in this area are expensive. We might need to move further out, which means a longer commute for all of us. And many places want first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit up front. That's thousands of dollars, Stephanie added worriedly. Money we don't have right now. What about your savings? Megan asked me suddenly. You're always talking about how much you're saving for a down payment. Can't you help? I felt 3 pairs of eyes turn to me expectantly. The irony was almost too much. Now they wanted my help after pushing me to the basement and treating me as an afterthought for years. Actually, I said slowly, reaching into my pocket, I might have a solution. I placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward Dad. He looked at it questioningly. "What's this?" "Open it," I suggested. Dad broke the seal and pulled out the documents. He scanned the first page, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then his eyes widened as comprehension dawned. He looked up at me, his face a mask of disbelief. "This says," he began, then stopped, unable to continue. What Stephanie pressed, leaning over to see the document. "What does it say?" "It says Horizon Property Holdings, LLC, is the new owner of this house." Dad replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Logan. Logan is the sole owner of Horizon Property Holdings." A stunned silence fell over the kitchen. Stephanie's hand flew to her mouth. Megan's jaw literally dropped open. Dad continued to stare at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "You bought our house," he finally managed to ask. "I bought my house," I corrected him gently. "The house I grew up in. The house I was kicked out of. Well, my room at least, to make space for Megan." "How did you even know about the auction?" Stephanie asked. "I found the foreclosure notice in Dad's desk when I was looking for a screwdriver," I explained. After that, I started doing research. When I realized how serious the situation was, I had to make a decision. "So what happens now?" Dad asked, his voice tight with some emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Are you evicting us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. This was the moment I had imagined countless times over the past weeks. But now, faced with their shocked expressions, I found my rehearsed speech inadequate. "No," I said finally. "I'm not evicting anyone. This is still our family home, but things are going to be different from now on." Megan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly found her voice. "You can't just buy our house and then make demands. That's extortion or something." "It's not extortion, Megan," I replied calmly. "It's ownership. And frankly, it's the only reason you still have a roof over your head right now. If I hadn't bought this place, some investor would have, and they wouldn't have been nearly as understanding about your situation." Dad placed the documents carefully back in the envelope. When he looked up, his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know whether to thank you or be furious with you." "You could try both," I suggested with a small smile. "I'd understand either reaction." "Why didn't you just offer to help us directly?" Stephanie asked. "Why go behind our backs like this?" "Would you have accepted my help?" I countered. Dad wouldn't even discuss the financial problems with me, let alone accept money from me. He made that very clear when I tried to talk to him about it. Dad had the grace to look ashamed. "I was trying to protect you from our problems. You're just starting your adult life. It wasn't your responsibility to bail us out." "Maybe not," I agreed, "but it was my choice to save this house, and now we all have to live with the consequences of that choice." The silence that followed was deafening. Each person at the table seemed lost in their own thoughts, processing the massive shift in family dynamics that had just occurred. I had gone from the young adult son relegated to the basement to the owner of the property. The power dynamic had been completely upended. Finally, Dad broke the silence with a question I hadn't anticipated. "Are you moving back into your old room?" I couldn't help but laugh at the directness of the question. "Yes, Dad. I am definitely moving back into my room." And with that simple statement, the tension in the room seemed to crack slightly. Stephanie managed a small smile. Even Megan, after a moment of obvious internal struggle, gave a reluctant nod of acceptance. The first step toward our new normal had been taken. Where we would go from here was still uncertain. But at least the truth was finally out in the open. The house was saved, and with it perhaps our family. The days following my revelation were strange and tense. The family moved around each other cautiously, as if walking on eggshells. Megan sullenly packed up her things from my room without being asked, moving back to the guest room she had previously occupied. Dad seemed to age overnight. The pride that had kept him from admitting financial trouble now replaced by a humbled demeanor I had never seen before. Stephanie tried to maintain some normalcy, preparing meals and attempting small talk, but the shifted power dynamic was palpable in every interaction. I moved my belongings back upstairs, reclaiming the space that had been mine for so many years. The lavender paint on one wall stood out as a reminder of Megan's brief tenancy, but I decided to leave it for now. Some battles weren't worth fighting. About a week after the revelation, Dad knocked on my door one evening. It was the first time he had sought me out directly since learning I had purchased the house. "Got a minute?" he asked, hovering in the doorway. I nodded and gestured to the desk chair while I sat on the edge of the bed. Dad looked uncomfortable, running his hand through his thinning hair, a nervous habit he'd had for as long as I could remember. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Actually, several apologies." I waited, giving him space to continue. "I should have been honest about our financial situation. I should have asked for help before things got so out of hand. And I never should have asked you to give up your room." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I've been a terrible father to you, especially since your mom died." The raw honesty caught me off guard. "You haven't been terrible, Dad, just distracted." Distracted is a kind way of putting it. He sighed heavily. "The truth is, after your mother died, I was lost. When I met Stephanie, it felt like a second chance. And Megan, she reminded me so much of your mom sometimes. The creative spirit, the emotional intensity. I think I overcompensated, trying to make her feel welcome, trying to be a good stepfather. At my expense," I added quietly. Dad nodded, not defending himself. "At your expense. You were always so self-sufficient, so capable. It was easy to convince myself you were fine, that you didn't need as much attention. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology was unexpected, and I realized desperately needed. A knot of tension I had carried for years began to loosen slightly. "What happens now?" Dad asked after a moment of silence. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I replied, "starting with getting our finances in order." The next day I called a family meeting of my own. Around the kitchen table I laid out a plan for moving forward. "I've established a reasonable rent for the house," I explained, showing them a figure that was significantly less than the previous mortgage payment. "This covers the new mortgage and gives me a small buffer for maintenance and repairs." "That seems fair," Stephanie agreed, while Dad nodded silently. "Dad and Stephanie, you'll split this payment." "Megan." I turned to my stepsister, who was slumped in her chair. "It's time you contributed as well." "With what money?" she scoffed. "I don't have a job." Which brings me to point 2 of our new arrangement. Everyone who lives here needs to contribute financially or otherwise. If you're not working, you need to be actively looking for work or enrolled in education. No exceptions. Megan started to protest, but Dad silenced her with a look. "Logan's right. You're 22 years old. It's time." Additionally, I continued, "I found a financial counselor who specializes in family finances and debt recovery. I've scheduled an appointment for all of us next week." "We can't afford a financial counselor," Stephanie objected. "I'm covering it," I replied. "Consider it an investment in our collective future." Over the following weeks, a new rhythm began to establish itself in the house. Dad and I started spending time together on weekends, tackling long-ignored maintenance issues around the property. Stephanie took over managing the day-to-day finances with a renewed commitment to transparency. And Megan, after some initial resistance, enrolled in a vocational program at the local community college and found a part-time job at a coffee shop. The biggest surprise came from Megan. One evening, as I was fixing a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, she appeared in the doorway, awkwardly holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering me one. I accepted it with a nod of thanks, curious about this unprecedented gesture. "I've been a real bitch to you," she stated bluntly, leaning against the doorframe. "For years, actually." I couldn't help but laugh at her directness. "Yeah, you kind of have been." "I was jealous," she admitted, staring into her coffee. "This was your house, your dad. I always felt like an intruder. so I tried to claim as much territory as I could. Make it mine, you know. I get that, I replied, surprised by her insight. But you had your mom. I had no one. She nodded, accepting this truth. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. And thanks for not throwing us out. You could have. We're family, I said simply. Dysfunctional, but still family. She smiled slightly at that. The guest room's actually not that bad. I've been redecorating. Just don't paint it lavender, I joked, and we both laughed, easing into a more comfortable silence than I would have thought possible just months earlier. The financial counseling sessions proved invaluable. With professional guidance, we created a realistic budget and debt repayment plan. Dad and Stephanie's credit would take years to rebuild, but they were on the right track. The counselor also helped me establish clear boundaries between my role as property owner and family member, preventing potential conflicts of interest. 6 months after buying the house, I hosted a family dinner to celebrate our progress. The dining room table, cleared of bills and financial paperwork for the first time in recent memory, was set with the good dishes that had been my mother's. Dad grilled steaks in the backyard while Stephanie prepared sides. Even Megan contributed, baking a surprisingly delicious apple pie for dessert. As we gathered around the table, I looked at each face and realized how far we had come. Dad seemed younger somehow. The constant stress lines around his eyes softened. Stephanie laughed more freely. Megan, while still prone to moments of self-absorption, showed flashes of maturity and consideration that would have been unthinkable before. I'd like to make a toast, Dad said, raising his glass. To Logan, who saved our home and gave us all a second chance we didn't deserve. To family, I corrected, raising my own glass. And to new beginnings. Later that evening, as everyone dispersed to their respective rooms, I found myself alone in the kitchen. I took out the photograph of Mom and me at the beach, the one I had carefully packed away when forced to move to the basement, and placed it on the refrigerator where it had always been during her lifetime. Standing back, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The house was saved, the family was healing, and I had found my voice and my place within these walls. It hadn't been the path I expected to take, but sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most necessary growth. The basement still flooded in the spring, but now it was just a maintenance issue to address, not a symbol of my displacement and insignificance. My bedroom was mine again, a sanctuary rather than a battleground. And most importantly, the dynamics that had left me feeling invisible for so long were finally changing. Did my family take advantage of me for years? Absolutely. Was buying the house an extreme response? Perhaps. But in the end, it forced us all to confront the underlying issues that had been tearing us apart. Sometimes, you have to shake the foundation to rebuild something stronger. If you've ever felt taken for granted by family, know that you're not alone. Standing up for yourself doesn't always require buying a house at auction, but it does require finding your voice and establishing boundaries. Have you ever had to take drastic measures to change a family dynamic? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in these family struggles makes all the difference. Thanks for listening to my story. And remember, family is what you make of it, even when it's complicated.